Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 31, the Battle of Arnhem and the Operation Market Garden in September 1944. As always, to give people a bit of time to join the stream and what have you, I'm going to start us off with a tune.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new God's sullen peoples have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, a loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly proffered laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come down to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden,
And that was, of course, the excellent Chris Gard. Do go and check out Chris Gard's YouTube channel. He's also on X. But go and check out his YouTube channel if you like good music from somebody who's on our side of things. Okay, so this evening's his history stream, and it was Mitch's suggestion originally, I think, was that we're going to do the Battle of Arnhem and Operation Market Garden in September 1944. Now, before we start on this, I'd just like to say I am not a big fan of General Sir Bernard Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery. I'm not a big Monty fan, never have been. But on the other hand, he was certainly a very competent general. And the thing about Market Garden was, if it had worked, it might have finished World War II before Christmas in 1944, which would have saved a huge number of lives, British, American, Canadian, and German, and also Russian, incidentally. But it also might have meant that the Western Allies would have taken Berlin rather than the Soviets, which also would have been a good thing, in my humble opinion. It had various things against it, which we will get into, that made it difficult, but it was by no means impossible. It might have worked. And you also have to understand that the First Allied Air Army, which consisted of the of two American parachute divisions and a British airborne, the first British Airborne Division. The 6th British Airborne Division was the one that was used in Normandy in 1944 on D-Day and later. But the 6th hadn't yet seen action in Europe. They had seen action in other places because the Allied airborne troops, the British Airborne, first saw action in North Africa in 1943, which is where you get the Woe Mohammed war cry that the Paras still have. And they were also used in Sicily and Italy and what have you. So, and the same with the Americans. And the early drops were often disasters, particularly for the Americans, it has to be said, because the inexperienced American Dakota pilots, the transports that carried the Paras, often dropped them too early. And the same thing also happened to some British troops, and they were dropped into the sea and simply drowned, basically, because the pilots dropped them too early because they were just inexperienced. So that said, the Allied airborne forces who landed in Normandy, generally on the evening before the 6th of June, were pretty successful. Famously, the British managed to capture Pegasus Bridge, which was a vital bridge to stop the Germans counterattacking into the Normandy landing area by a coup de main using gliders. The Americans didn't use gliders basically for that. They did use gliders to carry their relatively few anti-tank guns and some of their light artillery, etc. But they didn't generally use gliders for coup de mains, which the British did. Although they chose not to at Arnhem, which is something we'll get into. Before I go on any further, I'm just going to ask my guests if they have anything they want to say in terms of introductory stuff. So, Adam or Mitch, do you want to have anything to say?
I mean, I'm a little more defensive about Montgomery, but I don't think that much. I mean, I do think to go in just very quickly into what you said about that like, obviously some of this is speculation, but like some people have speculated about what some of the motivations were behind doing Operation Market Garden. Like famously, Montgomery actually wanted to just charge all the way to Berlin, which was pretty nuts. I don't know why he thought that would work, but he seemed to, like, some of the speculation, which I do actually think has some truth to it, is that Montgomery was worried about America taking too much of the lead in the war and what that would do and what that would mean for Britain in the sort of post-war treaties and the post-war fallout. And of course, he did also want to get to Berlin first. But yeah, but as well, like, I mean, Eisenhower gave it quite limited resources to the whole operation, I would say, which did hamstring it. But then, of course, he, Montgomery still like took that and decided that was still a good idea to run with. So I don't know. I think he's quite a hard character to decipher at times.
Yes, and he was very dislikable and not very tactful. What's the word I'm looking for? The meme about British officers is that they're very tactful and polite and all the rest of it.
And he wasn't that.
No, he was not that at all. And
No.
he managed to rub everyone up the wrong way. I mean, Eisenhower absolutely detested him in the end. What's his name? Patton hated him because he was kind of like the complete opposite of Montgomery, but also they were both famous World War II commanders who were vying for glory, and I'm sorry, there's nothing else you can call it. Bradley, I wouldn't say Bradley liked Montgomery, but he got on all right with him. But yeah, if you look at Bill Slim in the Far East, Bill Slim got on with everybody basically. Yeah. Even Stilwell, who detested the British, got on okay with Bill Slim. Montgomery was not that sort of character at all. But then there were many British officers who didn't like Montgomery. You were either a Montgomery man or you weren't.
Famously, though, a lot of his troops seemed to quite like him. Like they thought he could be a bit rough and a bit tough at times, but like generally, like one of the things I remember reading from his Sicily campaign was that a lot of his troops appreciated the fact that even though he could be a bit of a twat, like he would stand by his lads, as it were. If there ever came to any sort of divisional strife.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, when he would go and visit troops, he would always make sure his Jeep was full of packs of cigarettes that he would chuck out to the soldiers. And, he knew how to make himself popular with the troops, for sure.
Yeah.
Although I have to say, when I was like, I don't know, 14 or 15, something like that, I used to know a load of military veterans purely because I worked for this preservation society that did fishing in the middle of London, in what used to be the Surrey Docks, which had closed down by this stage, on the south side of the Thames. And loads of these guys were ex-military blokes, even from the First World War, when I was like a teenager, because I'm an old bastard. So you're talking about, early 1970s kind of stuff. And I remember I met a sergeant, an 8th Army sergeant, but he was a regular soldier, and he'd been out there with the Western Desert Force under O'Connor and all these guys. And he was a big supporter of Auchinleck, and said his view was that Montgomery got all the benefits of all the stuff that Auchinleck had prepared. But I mean, that was his view, but he was there and I wasn't, so whatever. But yeah, I'm not the biggest Montgomery fan. I think he did rub people up the wrong way when he didn't need to. Although I do appreciate what you said, Atman, about him being concerned about the Americans very much pushing the Brits into a secondary position in the war, and that's absolutely true. And he was entirely right about that, for sure. But his idea of a narrow push into Germany, rather than a broad front push, which is what Eisenhower and the Americans wanted to do, actually did make quite a lot of sense.
I think so.
I do. I actually do, because Eisenhower's broad push was always going to be incredibly slow, which it was. And that's even before And don't forget, we're talking about September 1944 here. So this is after the victory in Normandy, which was, by the way, down to Montgomery mostly, because Montgomery was the ground forces commander in Normandy. Eisenhower only took over at the end of the Normandy battle, really. And of course, most of the German armor was fighting the British and Canadians. It was not fighting the Americans. Three quarters of the German armor was fighting the British and Canadians, not the Americans. And that's why the Americans were eventually able to break out. Because they weren't facing many German tanks, basically.
So how does like a narrow push over such a long range work, like logistically? Because I know that Eisenhower's like big criticism of it is that you're having to risk too many casualties on your flanks to keep those flanks protected.
Well, that's the thing. You see, if you're only pushing on a narrow front, you then have enough troops to protect those flanks because you're only pushing on a narrow front. And of course, it also depends on how hard the enemy's going to fight. Now, with hindsight, of course, we know that the Germans in the West didn't fight half as hard as they did against the Soviets in the East. And with hindsight, we know that. But I suppose you could absolutely say that Eisenhower didn't know that at the time, although to me, it would be fairly obvious that if you were a German, you'd rather be taken over by the Americans or the Brits or the Canadians rather than the Soviets. But, that's just me using hindsight, I guess.
Yeah, it's like, I don't like Rommel's Panzer Division because Rommel was on holiday. So it left up to his second in command, Hans Speidel, who he ordered the Panthers to be largely stood down in the first few days of D-Day. Even though they could have been readily deployed against us on D-Day +2.
Could you move your microphone just a little bit closer to you, please, mate?
Oh, yeah, because I know that Rommel, he was on holiday at the time of D-Day, and what happened was he was his second in command, Hans Speidel, who he could have deployed tanks pretty much straight away against our troops on the beaches. But he didn't choose to do that because Speidel at that point, he saw where the wind was blowing and he was like, well, he doesn't want to get his lads slaughtered by the Allies because he thought, let's say for arguments, if the July plot were to succeed, he might think, get a deal with his Allies and then fight the Soviets. So he didn't want to.
This is another thing that's worth pointing out to people, Mitch, is that the July plotters, the people who tried to assassinate Adolf Hitler in July 1944, their idea was to make peace with the Western Allies, with the Brits and Americans, and still carry on fighting the Soviets. The Brits and Americans were not keen on that idea, and I think wrongly, but whatever. I've got the hindsight of knowing how bad Stalin was, and actually, I don't know how Western Allies didn't know how bad Stalin was.
I would say Churchill back in 1919. If you read Anthony Beevor's book on the Russian Revolution, Beaver talks a lot about how Churchill, he was writing a lot of letters to the White Russian side, telling them do this, that, and the other to win the war. He was also getting guys like Ewan and Cameron Bruce, I believe his name was, who took Soviets in literally with one tank to also work with the Russians more on defeating the Bolsheviks. So Churchill knew full well how bad the Bolsheviks were.
But he conveniently forgot it in World War II when he made us their allies, which again is not something I really agree with. But
there's actually a book called America's Siberian Adventure that goes into the American expeditionary force that was with the French and the British during the Russian Civil War. And one of the things it kind of covers is that the Americans even then were kind of pallying up to the Bolsheviks and were already kind of seeing it through these the really romanticized views. They just didn't have the same opinion, probably because of their own nation's founding compared to the powers in the old world.
For sure.
Yeah, I also remember reading, I can't remember where I read it, but apparently, so there was one time where Molotov, he was coming back from doing some deals with the Western Allies, especially Roosevelt, And Roosevelt basically agreed to some technological transfer from America in favor of the Soviets. The terms being so generous that when Molotov goes back home, he legit goes up to Barry and just asks him, "Have you got these guys on your payroll or something? Because they just gave me such really good terms, and I don't have any dirt on them or anything." That was how really skewed things were. Like the Americans were just being so generous to the Soviets in terms of a technological transfer back then.
Well,
Like even,
let's be honest, guys. The Lend-Lease that both Britain and America sent to the Soviets was never repaid, whereas Britain ended up paying for all of the Lend-Lease to the Americans. And I think we finally ended up paying for the last of it in the 1980s or something, under Thatcher. So, yeah, there's always been a bit of a two-tier story going on there, but yeah.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting Stalin's industrialization policies, they relied a lot upon American engineers. So it wasn't like it was a new thing with Roosevelt in World War II. Like in the 1930s, yeah, a lot of American experts were helping the Soviets with their 5-year plans. So that's another thing to think about.
Yeah, all right, but I mean, this is in grave danger of becoming an anti-American stream, as you guys will find out in due course. But I don't really want to make it an anti-American stream, to be honest. But I've got to tell the truth of what happened in this battle. So anyway, if Operation Market Garden had worked, it might have ended World War II by Christmas 1944, which would have saved hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives, because World War II got more violent the longer it went on. And the last year of the war killed more people than the previous 2 years. That's just the way the war went. It got more and more violent, and more civilians died. And as I say, if you could have ended World War II by Christmas 1944, you would have saved many, many, many thousands of British, American, German, and indeed Soviet lives, and others as well. But anyway, so it did have its merits. It had some intrinsic disadvantages. If you're going to advance in Holland with armored forces, and of course by 1944 you've got to have armored forces to do advances, you've got to go up the main roads, and the main roads in Holland's a very low-lying country with lots of boggy and flooded terrain. You know, this is why it has so many dikes, and its roads, the major roads, tend to be raised. And the problem with that is, if you're going up a single road that is raised with country on either sides of it, if you're the Germans, you can stick anti-tank guns in the woods on either side of that road and pick off the advancing armored vehicles one by one. And then, of course, you have to bring an armored bulldozer up, usually a tank with a dozer blade on it, and push the wrecked tank off in order to keep going forward. And also, one of the things we don't get so much these days is that the vision in a tank's not very good even today, really. You know, it's not that great. But there's infrared and there's all sorts of things on a modern tank, which in World War II they simply did not have. And so a tank on its own had very poor vision. In fact, large numbers of tank commanders of all nations were killed because they were actually advancing into battle with their head out of the tank, and nothing more than a helmet protecting their head. And a World War II helmet wouldn't even stop a rifle bullet. You know, it was designed to stop you being killed by falling bits of rock or shrapnel. It wasn't designed to stop a rifle bullet, and it wouldn't, let alone machine guns or anything else. So lots of World War II tank commanders of all nations were killed because their head was out of their turret because they had a better chance of surviving being able to see than being inside the turret where they could basically see fuck all in World War II, really. They were looking through a few periscopes or very thick blocks of glass in cupola. So you had to have infantry up with your tanks. If you didn't, the tank was blind, and infantry soldiers could come around behind it and stick sticky bombs or bundles of grenades or hit you up the arse with a pier or a bazooka or panzer.
They go into this
whatever.
on that video you sent me, actually, on the
Yes.
Murray video, about how, like, you know, tank warfare just stops during the night because it's
exactly.
just impossible.
In the modern world, we have infrared vision and all sorts of things on modern tanks, but they didn't have any of this in World War II. So a tank was pretty blind in daytime, but in nighttime it couldn't see anything at all. So generally what everybody did, and even the Germans did this, was at night, tanks would pull back a bit and go into what was called a Liga, at which point they would replace their ammunition, do any minor repairs they had to do, and all that. And then eventually the tank crews might get about 3 hours sleep before they were up the next morning. So you didn't really do tank fighting at night. It wasn't really possible in World War II. People think it is now because we have much better vision on tanks than we did then. You know, we've got like closed circuit TV cameras and all sorts of things on modern tanks. But even then, it's never really been tested in battle, to be honest.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, was it like the Gulf War where it was a terrible friendly fire incident where some of the Americans fired on our tanks? Like,
and some of the Americans fired on their own tanks as well. And British tanks fired on British tanks in the Gulf.
I think a series of videos people should check out. I think it's a series. That guy Lindy Page, he did some great videos with what's the tank museum? Bovington.
Bovington, yeah.
I think at Bovington, it's on their YouTube channel.
And he
goes into like
got some good videos.
Yeah, and he goes into like some of the difficulties they had with like their communication systems and stuff like that, because some of that stuff was hideously complex to manage.
Although this was the tank's advantage over the infantry. In World War II, like these days, you have soldiers in sections can talk to their section commander by radio. You couldn't do that when I was in the army. You certainly couldn't do it in World War II. And so where tanks did have a big advantage, that is that if you were a British, American, or German tank, not all Russian tanks, it has to be said, not all Soviet tanks, but all British, American, and German tanks had a radio. And so they often had a much better idea of what was going on in the overall battle than the infantry did, where radios in the British Army really only went down to platoon level. So, you know, you'd have 3 platoons would make up a company of about 100 or so guys. But your radios didn't really go lower than that. And not always as low as platoon level. Sometimes they only went down to company level in the infantry. Okay, let's set this up a little bit. Now, the airborne forces were a brand new thing in World War II. The Germans came up with the idea. Did they? The Russians came up with the idea in the 20s. The Germans came up with the idea in the 30s. I think the Germans were called Fallschirmjäger or something like that. Mitch will know the pronunciation better than I do.
Fallschirmjäger.
Fallschirmjäger, thank you. And they used them quite successfully in Holland and in the invasion of France and Norway and where have you. And then, of course, famously, the Germans launched a massive airborne invasion of Crete against the British and New Zealand and Australian troops there. And yes, they won, but they had so heavy casualties winning that the Germans never did another divisional drop again. Like the Italians wanted to do a parachute drop on Malta and Hitler just wouldn't do it because he was too worried about the casualties. And so the German parachutists in the second half of the war basically just became elite infantry, really. Indeed, they even had APCs sometimes and what have you. But the British copied this idea, so did the Americans. And here's a fun fact. In World War II, British paratroops did not have a reserve parachute. These days they do, of course, but back then they didn't.
Well,
And so
I mean, the thing back then as well is a reserve chute system would weigh like 10 kilos, which, I mean, they're already going for a pretty rough landing as it is. Can you imagine having to do that with 10 kilos of extra kit? That's
well, the
horrific.
Americans have one, Adam.
Yeah, I know, but that's how I know it's 10 kilos of extra kit.
Yeah,
I had to look up what the American system was by.
Well,
by
I don't
comparison.
know, mate. I'd sooner have a rough landing than realize my parachute hadn't opened and have to take it back. You know, it's like.
Yeah, I bet. I'm sure even back then, though, their main shoots had a pretty good success rate.
Oh yeah, look, your chances of your main chute not opening were not that high, but you know what? It's not infinitesimal, and quite a lot of British paratroopers jumped out of their Dakota and their chute didn't open, and they hit the ground and turns into a strawberry jam, basically.
Yeah.
You know? It did happen, and British paratroopers, unlike the Americans, didn't have a reserve chute. But anyway, to get more back onto the subject, British 1st Airborne Division consisted of 2 parachute brigades, which were each of 3 parachute battalions. And a parachute battalion in the British Army was 3 companies, whereas a normal infantry battalion and also the glider infantry battalions, the guys who landed by glider, they were 4 companies each. So a parachute battalion was a quarter weaker than a normal infantry battalion. To partially make up for that, they carried more Bren light machine guns. A normal British infantry platoon would have 3 Bren guns. Although it has to be said, by the end of the Normandy campaign, most of them had 4, partly because they've had losses and they just keep the extra machine gun. But in officially, they should have only had 3. A parachute platoon had at least 5, and occasionally had 6. So they had more firepower. Also, the British parachute and glider infantry units had a much better version of the Sten submachine gun than it was issued to everybody else. I think it was the Mark IV or Mark V, I can't remember now, but it had a proper wooden butt and also a handle under the barrel to hold it. And so it was a much better submachine gun than the poxy crappy thing that they gave to everybody else. In a normal infantry unit, only the platoon commander carried a Sten anyway, but the Paras had a better version of that. But they also lacked heavy weapons, and this is true of the Americans as well as the Brits. Most of their artillery was light 75mm airborne howitzers. The British did have a few light 25-pounders, which didn't have a gun shield because they were trying to make them lighter. But most of the artillery that an airborne division took into action was 75mm gun howitzers. And the 25-pounder was an 88mm, by the way. But anyway, and therefore had a much bigger and heavier, more powerful shell. Also, a normal infantry battalion had 6-pounder anti-tank guns as part of the battalion in the British Army. Whereas the Paras only had 4, which landed by glider. And then a parachute infantry brigade would have a whole 4 17-pounder heavy anti-tank guns, which landed by even bigger gliders called Hamel cars. But anyway, and the 6-pounders were pulled by jeeps. So they didn't have a lot of ammo either. That's the other thing, because, you know, ammo's pretty heavy, so you can't take that much ammunition. Other than that, if you're going to face tanks, as the British 1st Airborne did at Arnhem, you've got, in those days, you had a thing called a Piat, which was quite effective. I mean, it could even knock out a Tiger from the side, but you had to get bloody close. And I mean like 30 yards. And a tank's got 2 machine guns on it, you know. So getting that close is not that easy. And then, of course, because the Germans aren't stupid, they've got infantry around their tanks. That's why you have combined arms warfare. So you've got to get within, I don't know, 30 or at most about 50 yards if you're going to knock out a big German tank. And even then, you've probably got to hit it from the side. And because you're airborne, you're not carrying much ammunition. So you've got 1 Piat for a platoon of 30 guys. 3 platoons make a company. 3 companies make a parachute battalion. You've probably got between 6 and 12 rounds for that Piat, because that's all the ammunition you can carry. They also had 3-inch mortars, which were, you know, the standard infantry mortar of the day. Again, limited ammunition, because ammunition's heavy and you can't carry that much. And you can't move the stuff when it lands very far either, because you don't have transport. Now, one of the problems with the Arnhem plan was that the British were dropped a long way from Arnhem Bridge. And part of the reason for this is the RAF. And it wasn't the RAF pilots. I am not suggesting for 1 second that the RAF pilots were not the bravest of the brave, because most of them were. But the RAF High Command was extremely worried about heavy German flak over Arnhem itself, and so insisted that the drop zones be a ridiculous distance away from Arnhem Bridge. If you're doing a parachute drop, you want to land as close to your target as possible. Landing miles away is fucking ridiculous, because your blokes mostly have to walk.
Yeah, was it something like the one patch of territory, like one patch of ground that they could have dropped the 1st Airborne on, was rejected for them, but then a few days later, the Polish under Sosabowski, they landed there.
Yes, they did.
No trouble from RAF High Command, which I never understood. Like,
well, by that stage, the 1st Airborne Division were in grave danger of being destroyed, which they were. So therefore they took the risk. But initially, when they were planning it, the RAF said, no, there's too much danger of flak. You've got to land over here. And so they landed a lot of the 1st British Airborne, the 1st British Parachute Brigade, which was the main guys who had to capture Arnhem Bridge, were landed miles away from Arnhem. And then and to make it worse, to make it worse, Mitch, the Parachute Brigade itself, the commander, came out with a really ridiculous plan where he sent his 3 battalions by totally different routes. So instead of having enough force in one place to actually break through the German defenses, he attacked 3 times in very weak force. And only 1 battalion and a few elements of other people actually got to the bridge at all. And that was, of course, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, who was an excellent officer. But anyway, this was a problem, but there was also another problem. The American guy who was in charge of all of the transports, including the RAF ones, said that our air crews can only do 1 drop a day. And you're talking like to fly from the UK to Arnhem or one of the other bridges they were trying to capture, which we'll get onto in a minute. You're talking that's in those days in a Dakota was like a 3 to 4 hour flight, and this American Air Force general insisted our aircrew can only do 1 drop a day. Now I don't know about you guys, but I reckon if you can drop a para, be it a British or an American para, into a battlefield where he's flying against the SS and all the rest of it, which these guys were, for 4 days or however long they end up doing this, I reckon the Air Force pilots can probably do 2 trips a day. But no, they weren't allowed to. So instead of doing, and airborne operations depended on surprise. You land these really elite, good, highly motivated troops as close as you can to the target. They capture it very, very quickly with like really fierce action, lots of firepower, lots of elan, lots of, we're going to fucking bayonet you bastards. And so the enemy give up or run away. But once they're there, they're a pretty weak infantry force who've got very little heavy weapon support.
Well, yeah, and of course, this is one of the big problems they ran into, which was that they didn't really utilize all of their element of surprise. They took so long to get some of their objectives that, and they floundered a bit, and then the Germans started regrouping, and the element of surprise was lost, and paratrooper and airborne forces are a little bit squishy, if they haven't got that element of surprise on their side, and they start to get bogged down and have problems.
Yeah, it's like another Gavin when in Nimegen he puts a guy like that was a company or a battalion to take the bridge. But the guy he put in charge of that company or battalion was a guy called Lindquist, who Gavin himself said was not really that aggressive. Like, he wasn't a guy to go for the jugular. So that's even more questionable.
There's some controversy over that, Mitch, which we'll get into in a bit. But yes, you're entirely correct. The thing is, because of the way the air forces worked out the landing zones, and the landing zones were down to the air forces, not the paras. Any sane para wants to land as close to his objective as possible, right? That's always what you want to do. But the landing zones for Operation Market Garden were actually worked out mostly by either the United States Air Force or the RAF Transport Command. And as I say, I'm not impinging the pilots in the least degree. Many of them were extremely brave. In fact, probably most of them. But the high command of those air forces insisted they avoid all areas of flak, and they stay away from all this kind of stuff. And by this time, by the way, the German Luftwaffe was like mostly destroyed in the West. So they weren't much of a threat at all, but they were worried about the German anti-aircraft flak guns, like 20 millimeter and 37 millimeter and 88 millimeter guns. They were worried about those things. And, fair enough, but you've got to like weigh that up with how many soldiers you're going to get killed by not landing them closer, which I don't think they did very well. And so all of the drops, the 2 American divisions and the British division, which was the furthest one away, that was always the most risky one, they were much too far away from their landing zones, and the British actually were the worst of all of them. Like as Mitch was saying, they were quite a few miles away from where they needed to go. So what the Brits were planning on doing to try and make up for this was they wanted to land, well, they did land, a squadron of airborne jeeps. And these things had machine guns on them and what have you. And the idea was that I think there were about 24 of these Jeeps. Maybe it was 22, but something like that. And they were supposed to go to Arnhem quickly, but they got ambushed on the way. And the thing about a Jeep is it's got no protection. And so if an MG42 opens up on you at close range, you're all going to fucking die, and you're going to fucking die really quickly. And that's what happened to that reconnaissance squadron of Jeeps. Like you could run operations like that in the Western Desert, where it was all, there weren't troops everywhere because it was such a huge area. And so you could have like the SAS and the long range desert group operating Jeeps miles behind German and Italian lines in the Western Desert, just because there were no troops there, basically, most of the time, until they got close to their targets. The SAS did operate patrols in Northwest Europe, but they were nowhere near as successful because it's a different country, and there were relatively more German troops around.
Well, you even see this when they assaulted the bridge during Operation Market Garden. Is the town called Grave or Grav?
Grav,
I mean, even when they went, and it's like the Germans tried to reinforce that quite quickly, and they showed up on half tracks, which is like actually quite an armored vehicle compared to a Jeep. And the infantry still just, the airborne there still just like lit them up.
Yep, absolutely. They came up the road, I think, with 2 trucks in front of 2 half tracks, and the Americans just shot all of them up, and put bazooka rounds into the half tracks and killed loads of them, and the rest of the Germans ran away. What else can you do?
Yeah.
It's that sort of a vehicle is very vulnerable, but a half track is armored, whereas a Jeep isn't armored at all.
Yeah.
So the idea of this squadron rushing to Arnhem Bridge didn't work. They were ambushed and destroyed. I don't know, not even halfway there, I think. The guys whose video you were watching earlier, Adam, and they did a video in their series on Arnhem where they actually went to the spot where these guys were ambushed, and you can see they didn't stand an earthly. The Germans were on top of a railway embankment, firing down with several MG42s, and these guys were just on this road at the bottom, and they were just seeing ducks. They didn't stand up earthly,
Yeah.
This didn't work at all. Another problem the Brits had, and this is a constant problem with the Brits, it was even a problem with the British Army in Afghanistan, is their radios didn't always work. I don't know what it is. I just don't know what it is, but British radios have a very bad reputation and often don't fucking work. And the British 1st Airborne Division basically lost contact with its base almost as soon as they landed. And if you can't have radio communications, that means you can't get air support, you can't do all sorts of things.
Yeah, what's his name? Digby Waffen, from what I got, basically the guy with umbrella. He's Digby. I know, like he famous, like he never trusted radios. He trusted flag signals. He was a bit old school that way. He was only 27, I believe.
And part of the reason he carried his umbrella was that he knew no German would do that, so no one would shoot it. That was part of his idea of carrying the umbrella. Like, no German officer is going to carry an umbrella. So if a British sentry sees a dude with an umbrella in front of him, he ain't going to think it's a Waffen SS guy. It's just not going to be. But true story. But anyway, so yeah, communications broke down pretty quickly. As I say, one of the big problems was that starting as far away as they had to because of the RAF, to try and get to Arnhem Bridge, instead of like doing one powerful push that could have pushed the fairly small German forces in front of them out of the way, they went by 3 different routes, which meant none of them were very powerful. And Frost only got through because he was on a route where there were no Germans, basically. And also he was an extremely good officer and led his men around any problems he came to. But it still meant that only a battalion and a few bits and pieces actually got to Arnhem Bridge at all. The other guys never got there. And meanwhile, the Air Landing Brigade, which was the brigade that landed by glider, which had 4 companies per battalion rather than 3. So instead of having 9 companies, they had 12, which made them much more powerful. They spent their time guarding the drop zone for day 2. In other words, they're waiting for these other forces to come in. And the reason they had to do that, of course, is because the RAF and the United States Air Force said, our pilots can only do 1 drop a day. Even though you're talking about a 3.5 or 4 hour flight, really. I don't know. I think I would have been inclined to say to those pilots, no, this time you're going to do 2 a day, boys. But, it's just me. So anyway, yeah, this goes on. And to let people understand what's going on here, the American, I think it's the 101st who dropped first, then the 82nd dropped second, and then the 1st British Airborne dropped third. And as I say, you're talking about really a single raised up good road that is pretty easy for the Germans to ambush. So, this is not going to be an easy thing to do. You're going to keep having to bulldoze knocked out tanks and half tracks and what have you off the road so you can carry on forward. Also, for reasons best known to himself, and I've never seen a good explanation for this, Horrocks, the 30 Corps British commander, did not start his troops forward until 2 o'clock on the first day. So instead of starting at dawn, which you would have thought was the sensible thing to do, 6 a.m. or whatever, he didn't start until 2. Never worked this out. He claimed later that it is because he wanted to see the aircraft overhead, so he knew it wasn't cancelled. But I mean, that sounds like a pretty bullshit excuse to me, because say it had been cancelled, his troops would have gone a bit into Holland. So what?
So what are some of the excuses that have been made for him doing that?
Only the one that he made, which was I wanted to see the aircraft overhead so that I knew it wasn't cancelled. You have to understand that before Operation Market Garden, the 1st Allied Airborne Army, which is what was used for this, had been stood up and then stood down for 8 operations, I think. They were looking for something to use the 1st Allied Airborne Army for and couldn't make their mind up.
Yeah.
And one of the original plans was just to drop the British in the same operation, but instead of dropping a division in each place, we were going to drop a brigade, which would have been even more bloody stupid. But anyway, that was one of the original plans, and Market Garden was kind of an upped plan from that. We wanted to use 1st Allied Airborne Army for something. What ended up happening after Market Garden was that the US Airborne guys ended up just fighting as ordinary infantry in the line. And that was really pretty much a waste of their training. And also because they had less men, and less weapons than other units, it was not a good use of them. The same thing happened to some British paras as well. But and none of these guys who were specially trained, all volunteers, none of them wanted to just fight as ordinary infantry. You know, that wasn't what they signed up for, basically. They were a corps elite, you know. So yeah, there was that as well. The first thing that went wrong was the Germans managed to blow up one of the bridges in the 101st Airborne's area, but that wasn't that bad. But it still meant what by the time 30 Corps got there, they were 33 hours late. But again, they didn't start until 2 p.m. on the first day of the operation. Why the fuck didn't they start at 6? You know, I don't understand this. I've never understood it. And Horrocks's excuse sounds like an excuse to me. I just don't understand why they did that. Why wouldn't you start at 5 or 6 a.m.? And then if you're 33 hours late at the first bridge, well, you're not, are you? You're 23 hours late, which is a lot easier to make up.
I know with a Grave or Grav bridge, or not Grav, Son bridge got blown up, and I had to repair that. I remember it was Horrocks and Vandeleur who they weren't particularly doing as much haste as we probably should have done, because they did it on the advice of a brigadier called Gwatkin, however you pronounce that name, who said, "Oh well, we can afford to be lax with the advance." So so there were some accusations of us, we Brits were just drinking tea while the paratroops got slaughtered. And it's like, well,
yeah, well that will come in later as well, Mitch. I've just got to say to Key Buckley here, he was trying to find his brown trousers. I presume you're talking about Horrocks. Not true, mate. Horrocks was really badly wounded in North Africa. You can have your criticisms of Horrocks as a commander, but you can't possibly criticize his bravery. He was an extremely brave man. And if anyone wanted to find his brown trousers, it wasn't Horrocks. Horrocks was a brave man. So that's just not fair, mate. Although you can criticize Horrocks as a tactical commander for sure. I don't know what the delay was for, Key Buckley. We've just been talking about this for 10 minutes. I thought I explained. Horrocks said he wanted the aircraft overhead, so he knew it wouldn't be cancelled. Now, I think that's a fairly pathetic excuse, but that's the best we have. We have nothing else. The guys could have started 8 or 9 hours earlier, and instead of being 33 hours late, they would have been 22 hours late, which would have been much more easy to make up.
To be fair, though, for example, when you have a Sun bridge blown up, to be fair, 30 Corps were able to make good and made delay, so they're able to speed fairly well up to Nimegen. But then Nimegen was just a massive delay in and of itself because of Gavin. So it's kind of one of the things where, even though there was quite a bit of a delay on Horrocks' part, on 30 Corps' part, like there was still a scenario where the operation could have still been successful despite the delay, because First Airborne up in Arnhem held on for so long.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you need to understand is that the British First Airborne Division were told they might have to hold on up to 48 hours. And that was their extreme estimate. In fact, they ended up lasting over 4 days. So more than twice that. Yeah, absolutely true, Mitch. So, Key Buckley, you say why the delay? I can't tell you, mate, and I don't think anyone can. But you know, we'll move on. That was the only problem in the 101st Airborne area, really. Other than that, they all captured their objectives. In the 82nd Airborne area, there were more problems. And part of this, and it's not always well brought out. Now, some of you guys will know TIK, T-I-K history. And I have many, many disagreements with TIK about politics and philosophy, many. But when he sticks to tanks, which he doesn't like to do, but when he does, he's actually pretty damn good. And his video on Market Garden is actually very good and very well researched because he sticks to tanks in that one. But anyway, it's very good and very accurate. And one of the sorry, Mitch, carry on.
I was going to say, I'll let you go. And I thought he was going to mention Gavin for a second. I'll hold off.
Yeah, I'm going to get back to it. But yeah, one of the problems with the 82nd was that Gavin, who was this film star American general, he literally used to fuck film stars. That's what he did. Like, he was a cool guy. Don't get me wrong. He was. Like, famous American film beauties, Gavin was screwing. And he was a good commander and also a very brave man. He broke his back basically on his landing at Arnhem and still carried on commanding. Like, he cracked one of his vertebrae. But anyway, Gavin was on a place called the Grosbeak Heights, and it overlooked a big forest. Gavin, UFO. General Gavin, look him up. But anyway, he was on a place called the Grosbeak Heights, and to his east was Germany and a forest. And for reasons best known to himself and his intelligence officers, Gavin thought there could be 1,000 German panzers in that forest.
Sorry.
Hang on a minute, Mitch. I'll pass it over to you in a sec. Now, I've got to tell you guys, the Germans would have had orgasms of joy if they'd have had 1,000 panzers in the West at this stage of the war. They didn't. So there wasn't. What was in this wood was a very low quality, thrown together German home defense division with a few self-propelled guns and things, but not much. Very low quality troops, not many of them, and not even 50 tanks, never known 1,000. But Gavin thought that this was a possibility. And to make it worse, the First Allied Airborne Army's commander, a British officer known as Browning, decided he was going to land also here because it was in the middle, you see. One American division south of him, one British division north of him, so he landed in the middle. But Browning should have stayed in England, to be honest, because he had no real direction over the battle. He couldn't have. But he did take away dozens of Allied Dakotas and lots of gliders to land his Corps headquarters there, which did nothing, by the way. It was well, that's not true. Browning apparently walked over to the German border and was the first British officer to piss in Germany. Well, big fucking deal, boy. But anyway, yeah, this was a complete waste of resources. All of those Dakotas and gliders that landed Browning's HQ should have been used to land more of the 1st British Airborne Division on day one, giving them a much better chance of taking and holding Arnhem Bridge. But, you know, he didn't do it because he wanted to get into action himself. Partially understandable, I guess, but it got a hell of a lot of his own soldiers killed and captured. Sorry, Mitch, carry on.
So with Gavin, it's reckoned that he focused so much on the heights because I forget the name of a battle. I forget which battle he served in Italy, but he had to do. But there was one battle where the Germans had the high ground on him, and they incurred heavy casualties on his men while he was in Italy. So when it comes to Nimegen, he tells Browning, the first thing I would like to do is occupy those heights, and Browning green lights this. So it's a matter of Gavin can be blamed because he deprioritizes a bridge, but on the other hand, the buck also stops with Browning because Browning he could have vetoed it and said no, focus on the bridge only, but Browning greenlit Gavin's sort of little bit of initiative there. So I'll blame
100.
both.
Yep, 100. I totally agree.
Yeah, it's a situation. I mean, it's a situation similar to I don't want to go off to, but because at Battle of Gettysburg, you have a guy called Sickles. He goes off from his position on the left flank of the Union Army to take some high ground. On one hand, it saves his troops from getting bombarded by Confederate artillery, but it opens up the left flank of the Union Army and screws them over that way. Likewise, it's probably best, and likewise, yeah, that's what Gavin ends up doing with Nimegen. Like that's why, yeah, like the battle is much prolonged because there were only like 19 Germans, mostly teenagers, defending that bridge at Nimegen. He could have taken it. He had 8,000 men, if I remember correctly. Plus, he also had a lot more anti-tank guns than would usually be the case, because he also feared set panzers. Because while he was in Italy, he also lost a lot of men to the Hermann Goering Panzer Division, and he didn't want to repeat of that experience. So had he taken that bridge, let's say he feared being attacked by like 100 panzers or whatever, and had taken that bridge, he would have been able to hold that bridge fairly easily, like the 1st Airborne had done, despite the 1st Airborne not having as much anti-tank weaponry. So, you know.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you, Mitch. Momo Keo in the chat, yes, we have talked about that, and we talked about it right at the beginning of the stream.
Yeah, it's basically my primary source for this.
But yeah, and of course, by the way, in World War II, the main American anti-tank gun was the 57 millimeter, which was actually an American license-built version of the British 6-pounder, which not everyone realizes, but it was. But anyway, yeah. So Gavin thought there could be 1,000 panzers in this forest, which there weren't, obviously. Like there weren't 1,000 panzers in the Western Theatre in September 1944. The Germans wished there had been 500 even. You know? But the British at Arnhem actually did face some panzers because there were 2 German SS Panzer divisions there. So there were even a handful of Tigers, not many, but some, which is a problem if you're a very lightly equipped parachute unit. So yeah, the Germans did have some tanks, but they were facing the Brits at Arnhem. They weren't facing Gavin at Nimegen. And the thing was that Gavin claims he told one of his battalion commanders on the evening before they dropped, your number one priority is to capture the bridge. The battalion commander doesn't agree with him, all right? And if you watch that video, which Momo Keo has just been talking about, they don't really go into this for whatever reason. They just don't. If you go and watch Tick's video on Market Garden, he does. And there are some inconsistencies with what Gavin claimed later and what contemporary orders show. But the fact is that the 82nd Airborne were dropped where they were dropped to take the Nimegen bridges. That's the only point of dropping them there. It's not to hold the Gross Peak Heights. It's to take the Nimegen bridges because if you don't take the Nimegen bridges, and there were two, a railway bridge and a road bridge, either of which would have done, because you can send tanks across a railway bridge with a little bit of preparation. There's no point in dropping there unless you take those bridges, because unless you take those bridges, then the British 30 Corps, which was an armoured corps headed by the Guards Armoured Division, they can't get to the British 1st Airborne Division unless you have at least one of those bridges. Now, Gavin did, it has to be admitted, tell one of his battalion commanders, one of his regimental commanders, how to go for the bridge, and it was a sensible way to go for the bridge, which avoided the town of Nimegen. But this bloke ignored it, and he went through the middle of Nimegen, and he didn't send enough troops. And despite the Dutch resistance telling the Americans there were a whole 18 Germans defending the main Nimegen road bridge on the first day, this dude didn't push on. There was some sniping and machine gun fire, and he just pulled his troops back. And so instead of taking Nimegen on the first day, which was vital if the plan was going to work, didn't happen. And by the time the second day came around, two camp groups of German SS troops had arrived, and the Germans were really brilliant at this in World War II. They could form a camp group, which is basically a fighting group, a battle group. They could form these out of any little groups of blokes put together, and they were always pretty good. Anyone ever tells you the German soldiers in World War II weren't good, just call them a liar, because they were. They were generally pretty damn good. And
yeah. I'm sorry.
No, carry on, Mitch.
As TK2 said, they were scraping the bottom of the barrel, because there were times where I think there was like one unit in my camp group where most of the guys were amputees. They were missing like an arm or
I can believe it. I can believe it. But the Germans would throw together groups of whatever troops were available under a good commander, and they would always perform creditably, always, or almost always anyway. So the Americans didn't take this. They didn't take the Nimegen Bridge on the first day. And by the second day, there were big German reinforcements arriving, including two camp groups of German Waffen SS. And the Waffen SS were generally pretty good. Included enough experienced officers and NCOs that they generally performed pretty well. And so you ended up with street fighting all the way through Nimegen. But bear in mind, to give Gavin his due, he had told this commander not to attack that way. And the guy ignored him. He just went through the town anyway. And so you had a day of fighting. No one got very far. Then 30 Corps turned up, the British armoured troops. And the first Sherman they had got knocked out as it came around the corner. And you have to understand that in street fighting, tanks are extremely vulnerable. You've got to have infantry all the way around them all the time, basically. They're quite powerful because machine guns can't hurt them, but loads of other things can knock them out. And so you have to have infantry all the way around them. And a British Sherman got knocked out. And that was the end of the fighting for that day. Then you go into the third day, and by this time, the British 1st Airborne Division is doomed. It's just too late. You had to capture Nimegen, one of the Nimegen bridges on the first day. The Nimegen Bridge is also the one, if you've watched A Bridge Too Far, which is not a film I'm very fond of, to be honest with you, because there's a lot of nonsense in it. But one of its famous scenes is where the American paratroops row over the Rhine, row over the river there, and under fire, but with loads of supporting fire. And yeah, those were very, very brave guys, but they shouldn't have had to do that. They should have captured the bridge from the 18 Germans who were holding it on the first fucking day. That was why the whole division was dropped there. And they didn't do it.
Why don't you like the film? Because I haven't seen it. But I hear a lot about it.
All the British officers, except for a couple of junior ones, are made to be idiots, like from Montgomery on downwards.
Oh, right.
All of the Americans, whether they be a general, a captain, a sergeant, or a private, are all great. And the British have things like Bailey crap, which is the brilliant British Bailey Bridge, which the Americans had no equivalent of, but, forget about it. It goes on also, and we haven't got there yet, but I'll come on to the British finally getting across Nimegen Bridge and the Americans all going off alarming because the 4 tanks that had got across didn't immediately rush and go and get killed by the Germans.
Oh, yeah. I remember because they even cover this a little bit in Band of Brothers, where they make out like the British tank commanders are all just kind of sitting around having tea and don't have much interest in pushing the offensive. But of course, it kind of misses some fairly obvious issues with tank assaulting to begin with. But yeah.
Key Buckley, by the way, Robert Redford just died yesterday, I do believe.
Oh.
And I thought he was a pretty good actor. I liked the fact that he liked Mustangs and wild horses and stuff. Didn't agree with him politically on many things, but that was all right. And he was a pretty good actor. I love, what is it called? All Hope Is Lost, I think, was one of his later films where he's a yachtsman in it. That's brilliant. And I liked Jeremiah Johnson, where he plays the mountain man. To me, they were his 2 best films. But anyway, But yeah, anything else to say, gents, before we move on to the final bit?
No, not from me.
Mitch?
My mind's coming to blank, so I don't think so now.
All right. Well, anyway, so the thing is, after 3 days of street fighting, which Gavin did sensibly want to avoid, and which his Italian commander took no notice of it, went through the town anyway. Not the best American airborne commander there's ever been, this guy. Can't remember his name now. But anyway, and not a Chad either, by the way. But anyway, when the British finally fought their way through to the Nimegen Bridge, and the British infantry from the Guards had to take a full part in this. Like, there was one attack that was mixed American and British, and the other attack was totally British to get to the bridges. When they finally got there, they managed to get a few tanks across the bridge. And these tanks had to use their commander machine guns to shoot German snipers off of the girders of the bridge as they were going across.
The only thing I disagree with there is I don't think they were snipers. I think it was more they were it's recommended they were sappers or engineers trying to blow up a bridge, because I think it was like, so Mulder, who was in charge of German defense overall, he didn't want to blow it up because the Fuhrer gave him orders saying, keep that Nimegen bridge intact, we want to counterattack. But Harmel, who is one of the main commanders on the ground, he's thinking, well, they're going to take the bridge and they're going to be in a position to relieve Arnhem. I need to blow it up because it's not like we're going to be able to counterattack anyway. And that's, but like, of course, the because in the film it portrays it as Robert Redford and his like paratroopers only, like it's only the Americans, whereas in real life now there were Brits working with the Americans in that assault.
Yeah, and the street fighting, which they don't show at all, basically, in the movie, it's not shown. But the Brits and Americans were fighting through the town of Arnhem, and that's not shown in the film at all, actually. But so about a troop of 4 British tanks gets across the bridge. And they are shooting snipers out of the girders. Now, Mitch may well be right, and maybe there were sappers, but they were still sniping at the British commanders who, as I said earlier, World War II tank commanders tended to keep their head out of their turrets because it was actually safer to be able to see, even though you were liable to get a bullet in the head. And many tank commanders died that way in World War II. But anyway, they got across, and I believe this troop of tanks was under Carrington, who was later the British Foreign Secretary, who had to resign as a result of the Falklands War in 1982. And of course, Carrington was a guards officer because he was a terribly, terribly posh guy, and guards officers were almost always terribly, terribly posh guys. But anyway, neither here nor there, it's just a fact. And then Carrington is on the far side of the bridge. And by this time, it's like, I don't know, 6 or 7 in the evening. And as we explained earlier, at night in World War II, tanks went into Liga. They didn't operate because they couldn't see anything. Like, they didn't see very well during the day. At night, they couldn't see fuck all, basically. Nothing. So tanks basically didn't operate at night in World War II. They really just didn't. And no country's tanks did. Not the Germans, not the Soviets, not the Americans, not the British. And so the British stopped and they were brewing up tea. And these American airborne officers, 1 or 2 of them, were really angry. Why aren't you pushing on for Arnhem? And of course, Carrington had no infantry with him at all, right? And he had 4 tanks. Now, do you really think that 4 British tanks were going to absolutely go penetrate the German army in the dark?
Well, this is the thing. I think if you look at like Afghanistan, there was a couple of times in various modern engagements where people do see tanks operating almost independently, and partly that's also because of who they're against. Sometimes
in the desert to a point.
And as well because modern tanks are just they're in a league of their own. But
you can see better in a modern tank, Adam. Yeah. But let me tell you, doctrine still for all tanks is you don't operate on your own.
No, because you're too vulnerable. You need that. You need that web of support. You need.
You need some infantry as well.
Yeah, and the thing is as well when you go back. I mean, like we was talking a second ago, and Momo brought it up about the Al Murray and the James Holland thing. They actually, in that video, they drive in a tank column, didn't they?
Yes.
Over the bridge, and they're doing it in the day in like modern rush hour in modern Holland, and yet the noise, right, and the size of these things, like you could just imagine how vulnerable something like that would be trundling down the road in the dark, at anything past 8 in the evening. It would be a terrifying place to be.
Yeah, absolutely, Alma. But the idea that, these callous British tank crews just sat there and brewed tea while the poor airborne were dying at Arnhem is just a fucking lie. If Carrington and his troop of 4 tanks, let me remind you, with no infantry support, if they'd have pushed on, even if some of those American airborne had gone with them, they would have all just died. They would have all been killed at the first German ambush.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, if I'm in command of that tank troop, I'm not going to get my men killed for fucking nothing. because they're still not going to relieve the guys at Arnhem.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the other thing. I mean, maybe I'm jumping too far ahead, but was Frost and the 1st Airborne done the dirty by being put where they were?
Not really, because as has been pointed out by Americans, you couldn't have put an American division in that position. Because if they'd have been destroyed like 1st Airborne Division largely was, there would have been such a stink in America. They would have said, oh, the dirty fucking Brits let us down.
Yeah. But should they have been put so far ahead so early? I suppose they had to be. I suppose you couldn't have landed them later.
The whole point of Market Garden was you laid down an airborne carpet of troops who would allow your armor to speed through the area. But for it to work, and it could have, everything has to go well.
Yeah.
And too many things went wrong. Like, for example, it wasn't Montgomery's fault that the RAF and to some degree the American Army Air Force decided they were going to drop the paratroops too far away from their objectives. It wasn't Montgomery's fault because that wasn't something he could plan for.
Well, there was, I mean, I suppose one unit that was really done the dirty, and I can't remember the name of the unit. There was a Polish unit, wasn't there, that came in?
Yeah,
were they in gliders?
The Polish Independent Parachute Brigade was dropped to support the 1st British Airborne Division.
Yeah, they got fucked almost as soon as they landed, though.
Yeah, because by this stage, the 1st Airborne Division couldn't even defend their drop zones.
Yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't like at this point, Roy Urquhart and his men, they were forced into the Oosterbeek heights west of Arnhem, while John Frost was hanging on to the north end of Arnhem Bridge by his fingernails. I think he was wounded at that point as well. Like he got shrapnel in the knee as well. So
Jesus.
And also by that point, the drop zones that there were around Arnhem, they were dropping stuff like chocolate and cigarettes onto the Germans, pretty much, because the drop zones had been taken over by the Germans.
Absolutely true. And Urquhart, let's remember, Urquhart, one thing the movie gets right, although it doesn't really show you the true story, Urquhart, because he pushed forward, which he probably shouldn't have, actually, as the divisional commander, he pushed too far forward, and he was trying to do like a company commander's job or a battalion commander's job rather than being the divisional commander. He got cut off by German armored troops for hours and hours and hours, and it does kind of show it in the film, and it does show that Urquhart kills a couple of Germans through a window with his Browning pistol, but Urquhart shouldn't have been there. He should have been commanding his division. Although, again, British fucking radios didn't work properly, which made it very difficult for him to command his division.
Yeah, it wasn't just him. It was also his second in command, Lathbury. So
he was there too. Yep.
Yeah,
so all of the high command of 1st Airborne were missing for hours and hours and hours.
Yeah, it was like they had to spend like a night in the attic of a Dutch family.
100%. Yeah, 100%. There was a lot of combinations of bad planning, which I have to say, a lot of the bad planning, it was changed a lot. The operation, it wasn't given enough time to mature. And all of the airborne guys were desperate to go do it because they'd been stood down for so many other operations before this. And I'm talking about the Americans as well as the Brits. But the Air Force had a very deleterious effect on the planning because the drop zones, particularly for the British, were miles too far away from their target.
You do see when you look into some of the details, there did seem to be a lot of confusion over, like, amongst the various commanders about what success in Operation Market Garden was supposed to look like, which I suppose is why some of them there was quite a lot of confusion on the ground.
I mean, look, basically, it wasn't complicated. It was airborne troops captured bridges, the armored British 30 Corps crossed those bridges pretty quickly, and all of a sudden we make a big advance, and we cross the Rhine, which of course was, the border of Germany, basically, like the military border that you could defend. And had it worked, yeah, you might have won the war before Christmas in 1944. You might have, and also maybe the Western Allies would have taken Berlin rather than the Soviets, which would have been enormously good from the point of view of everybody later.
Yeah, because you have a Rhineland and a Ruhr, which if they were taken, let's say instead of it being like, I don't know, was it like late March or like early April when we actually took it? Let's say we took the Ruhr and the Rhine, let's say in, I don't know, October or early November. That shortened the war considerably because that's like, it's like the West Midlands used to be massively industrial. Likewise, the Rhineland and the Ruhr. Without those, Germany loses the war much swifter. It's like people would say that with Romania defects into the Russians, and our side, they shortened war by 6 months because Romania had a lot of oil that the Germans relied upon.
Also, Mitch, the Germans were much more likely to surrender to the British, Canadians, and Americans than they were to the Soviets. And so it was easier for the Western Allies to advance. And also, of course, if you cross the Rhine in September 1944, you probably don't get the Ardennes thing. The infamous Battle of the Bulge. You probably don't get that if the Western Allies cross the Rhine in September 44. How does Hitler launch that? He can't really.
Yeah, and it's another thing. The SS, especially under Wilhelm Dietrich, his SS Panzer Division, they suffered more casualties fighting John Forstmann than they suffered on the Eastern Front. Like in terms of percentage of casualties, suffered like 60% over like a few days, which that is far more than anything they suffered on the Eastern Front.
Which is wild as well. That's wild stuff.
Yeah, the British Paras were very, very good soldiers. I mean, I see why, even to this day, the British Parachute Regiment celebrates Arnhem. Even though it was a defeat, it was an extremely gallant defeat. And, the Germans were the first guys to admit that, the British Paras were at least as good as soldiers as they were, and probably better, actually.
Yeah, apparently there were cases where some SS troopers, they were planning on executing some of our guys taken captive. But then it was like Wilhelm Dietrich and some of his guys in higher command, they say, look, you shoot any of those paratroopers and we'll on board the court-martial and we'll just shoot you on the spot if you dare execute these men. Like there was a sense of like, I don't know, what would be magnanimity, I suppose, or like just soldierly respect from the Germans towards.
Yep. I totally agree. Lothar Sheffield makes a point about someone who won a VC who's related to Jeremy Clarkson. Jeremy Clarkson did a video on that dude, and it's a good video. Go check it out.
Was this the guy that got blinded, and he was holding down a position with a Piat anti-tank gun?
He actually, I think he ran out of Piat ammunition, and he knocked out a tank with a 2-inch mortar, which you're not supposed to fire the way he fired it. So, yeah. But I'm not sure he got blinded. I'm not sure about that. But I know Jeremy Clarkson has a couple of good World War II videos. One is on the raid on Saint Nazaire, which is pretty good. It's not entirely accurate, but mostly. And then he has a good one on
Yeah, my grandparents' old house was called Saint Nazaire House because the guy that had it when it was like a post-war new build, was one of the commandos who were at the raid at Saint Nazaire, who had to escape into Spain.
Fabulous raid. We will
Yeah.
do a video on that one day, because the Royal Navy took one of those crappy destroyers that Churchill gave away bases for from the Americans.
Wasn't it like the Rhode Island or something like that?
Yeah, and they were shit ships. They were really
Yeah.
crap because they'd been in reserve for 20 years. And put it to a good use by ramming it into the dry dock at Saint Nazaire, which was the only dry dock in Europe that was big enough to take the turbines. And we blew it up, and loads of commandos landed from like light Royal Navy boats and did lots and lots of damage. Yeah, we'll do a video on that one day.
Yeah, I think
But,
Jim Buckley near the beginning of the stream in chat said something like that the lend lease became a cash and carry. And you can see this with the gold shipments, and you can see it with the whole islands for ships agreement as well. That they just gave us just nothing but shit.
Yes, those 50 destroyers that Churchill thought were so vile, they were useless ships. And I don't think one of them came into service for like 15 or 16 months after they arrived in the UK. And even when they got into service, they had huge turning circles because they were very old. They were like early 1920s ships, and basically they weren't worth what Churchill gave away for them. By this time, the Royal Navy were producing plenty of good anti-submarine ships, and those 1920s US destroyers were never good anti-submarine ships. They had very big, wide turning circles, which was useless to try and hunt down a U-boat and hit it with depth charges. But whatever.
I just had a look at this at the Robert Henry Kane, Major Robert Henry Kane thing. And what it was one of his Piat rounds went off while it was still in the rifle.
That wouldn't have been too good.
Yeah, and he thought he was blinded, but he was taken to an aid station and he ended up being fine.
Yeah, it was temporarily. Someone said that in chat. I saw that.
Oh, right, okay.
Yeah, no, for sure, Adam. Yeah. So anyway, basically, Market Garden failed, but the real reason it failed was that Gavin's 82nd Airborne didn't take Nimegen Bridge or either of the bridges, the road bridge or the railway bridge. They failed to take either of them on the first day, which was absolutely vital to the plan. So if you want to see the real reason it was a bridge too far, it wasn't Arnhem, it was Nimegen. And that was the Americans. But then if you watch A Bridge Too Far, it's made by a very lefty British director. Attenborough was a big-time lefty. I used to be a big fan of David Attenborough, but I'm not these days because David Attenborough supports all sorts of net zero and nonsense shit that is just crap and is not doing any good for Britain or any other country that supports it.
Well, not that David Attenborough, is it?
Yes, it's his brother. That's his brother. Yeah, Dickie Attenborough, the guy who made A Bridge Too Far, is his brother. Did you not know that?
No, I didn't know.
Yeah, that's his brother.
He's oh yeah. He's been in quite a lot of stuff. I never really paid much notice.
Yeah, no, he was in some. His brother, David Attenborough's brother, was in a lot of good movies. Younger, but he's a lefty lovey, absolutely. And he directed A Bridge Too Far, and A Bridge Too Far is therefore a fairly lefty liberal film in that respect. And of course, it was funded by the Americans, and so obviously the heroes of the movie are the Americans, really, if you watch it.
Yeah, but then again, though, I mean, Zulu was not directed, but written by like lefties. But that's
no, it was directed by a lefty, Adam.
Right.
Cy Enfield was chucked out of Hollywood by the McCarthy stuff because he was a commie.
Yeah.
He was chucked out of there because he was a commie. And the bloke who wrote most of it, whose name escapes me for the moment, was a an English guy who lived in Canada for a lot of time, but whose most famous book is Culloden, which is completely anti-British and is not a very good history of the 1745 rebellion.
I've got a book on Culloden that I haven't read yet. I hope it's not that one.
Crikey. Let me look it up for you, mate, while I'm here.
Let me look up which one I've got. Mine is by Murray Pittock.
No, that's not him.
Oh, okay.
That's not him. I need to find out what he's called because it's going to annoy me if I don't remember it. I read it. It's a good book. Don't get me wrong. It's well written, but it's not particularly great history because the guy.
It's not John Preble, is it?
Yes. That's the main writer of Zulu. And he was a member of the British Communist Party, but he left just before World War II. He lived in Canada for a long time. Englishman, by the way, but he lived in Canada for quite a long time. And John Preble was the main writer for Zulu. And as I say, Cy Enfield, who was the director, was chucked out of Hollywood by the McCarthy stuff because he was a commie, basically.
I mean, Zulu's a little imperfect, but it's still very patriotic.
Is it? Yeah, I suppose to some extent. Look, it's got. If you're aware of it, it's got a lot of stuff in it. Like, for example, Private Hook.
Who they really do hurt dirty in the film.
Yeah, who they do the dirty on. They make him the Queen's hard bargain. Whereas, in fact, he was a very good soldier. He was detailed to make tea for the sick in the hospital. That's why he was in there. And he wasn't malingering or anything like that. But Private Hook in that movie says, "What are we here for? Did I ever see a Zulu walking up the city road?" You know? So that's in there. You've got the Surgeon Reynolds, right, who won the Victoria Cross, because unlike in the movie, in reality, he didn't spend all his time in the hospital building. He was going around the defences under fire and under spears from the Zulus, treating the wounded, like in the open. And his little dog, his is the little dog in the painting, although they didn't put that in the film. But his little dog bit at least one Zulu who came too close to his bloke, because he was a good little dog. But Surgeon Reynolds in the movie says, "Damn you, Chard! Damn all you butchers!" And he was a Royal Army Medical Corps guy. He would have never said that.
Yeah, but they do that for... I mean, I don't think they're doing it to be deliberately subversive. I think they're doing it because it's kind of like, to them, that's like basic post-war writing 101. You have to pick a couple of characters to be like that.
And then, all right, another one. Lieutenant Bromhead, played by Michael Caine, of course. Towards the end of the film.
Yeah, I know which bit you're going to say, where he says, "Oh, I feel like a coward." Is that what he says?
No, he said, "You know what? I feel ashamed."
Oh, yeah, that's it. Yeah, that is the one bit where I'm like,
What soldier ever felt ashamed because he wasn't dead? I'm sorry, go away. It's like, you know, and this was a professional officer. He didn't feel like that at all. There's quite a lot of that stuff in that movie if you watch it carefully enough.
Yeah, I know. I have picked up on all of it, but it's just like it's quite minor stuff in the grand scheme of things when you look
Oh,
at
look,
like
I love it. It's still my favorite
yeah.
film, Armin.
It's just it comes off
it's
considering
imperfect.
it was written and directed by like massive lefties. It does seem pretty patriotic for people
All
of their
right, I
persuasion.
tell you what I think saves it is much of the finances for the film came from Stanley Baker. And Stanley Baker was a massive Welsh nationalist. And one of the things the film changes is they make the battalion really Welsh. They're the South Wales Borderers, and they weren't. You know, they only became the South Wales Borderers in 1881, like 2.5 years later. At the time, they weren't. And they weren't particularly Welsh. There were probably more Londoners at Rorke's than there were Welshmen.
Yeah.
But the reason it keeps that bit of patriotism going that makes it acceptable to the likes of you and I, Armin, is really Stanley Baker's Welsh nationalism, if you think about it. It is. Just watch the movie and think about it.
Yeah, I know, because I did know about because like they changed the theme song because the Men of Harlech was weren't they singing a different song at the time, and Men of Harlech was later.
Yes.
Yeah.
Men of Harlech is a much older film, but the particular words they use in that movie is a more modern version.
Yeah.
But the fact is that the 2nd Battalion 24th weren't the South Wales Borderers then.
Yeah.
They were the Royal Warwickshire Regiment. So, different. So,
I mean, if they did mean it to be subversive, I think it's kind of backfired because no one who watched it ever seems to pick up on it.
Yeah, this is the thing. I'm trying to argue here, Armin, and we're way off topic of this stream. But what I'm trying to argue here is the reason it's acceptable to modern British patriots and nationalists like you and I and Mitch is because of Stanley Baker's Welsh nationalism, which wouldn't allow it to become anti-Welsh and therefore anti-British. Does that make any sense?
That. Yeah.
That's what stopped it tipping over. If it had been purely about an English regiment, and to be fair, the 24th always did have some Welshmen in it. Of course they did. And in particular, they used to recruit amongst the industrial Welsh in the Midlands, but who'd moved from Wales. But if that movie didn't have Stanley Baker making it a Welsh nationalist movie, then it would have been much more left-wing than it ended up. Yeah. That's what saves it for people like us today. Not only is there the singing of Men of Harlech as the final Zulu attack comes in, which of course was nonsense. It never happened.
Yeah.
But at the end of the movie, when they're going through all the Victoria Crosses and all the rest of it, they're playing Men of Harlech in the background. It was Stanley Baker's Welsh nationalism that kept that a based film, basically.
Yeah.
I think, anyway. I'm surprised that Academic Agent's never done something about this since he's a semi-Welshman. But whatever. Anyway, guys, do either of you have anything else to say on the Battle of Arnhem and Operation Market Guard?
Another charge I was for was that we didn't listen to the resistance in the Netherlands because they warned, for example, about the Panzer Division at Arnhem. And I think it was like Browning or someone else.
Can you come a little bit closer to your microphone, please, Mitch? Sorry.
I know, there was a lot of people who would say that we ignored the resistance, and because they warned of a Panzer Division on the Bitterk at Arnhem. But it's also worth noting that as that particular Panzer Division, it was barely the strength of a regiment. We had like 6 tanks, I believe, either for battle. They did get more, but that was because of blitz transport. That
Yes.
brought in lots more tanks after the first day. That's one thing about the Germans, that Mulder was able to, because Mulder was very much a fewest fireman, so he could just ring up the Wolfschanzer and just say to the viewer, look, I need this, that, and the other, and he got it, no problem. Whereas on our side, it was a matter of, for example, our guys in the 1st Airborne, they didn't have as much anti-tank as they needed.
Well, they
But
weren't told. But they weren't told, Mitch. Lieutenant Colonel Frost actually said, he said, had they told me that there were 2 panzer divisions in the area, which there were, although, as you say, they were by no means full strength, but they were nonetheless 2 panzer divisions, SS panzer divisions. Lieutenant Colonel Frost said, if I'd have known that, I would have taken more Pier ammunition for the British version of a bazooka, which was a Pier projectile.
Yeah, that's one thing. So that's another thing you can blame Browning for, that he never notified Roy Urquhart nor Frost. He never told the 1st Airborne, oh yeah, there are SS Panzer divisions in this
Browning,
area.
one thing I've got to say, Mitch, is that Browning was a bit worried. Browning had complained earlier about something, and I can't remember what it was now.
Is that famous quote, a bridge too far, you want about?
No. He had threatened to resign over something before Market Garden. And unfortunately, his superiors turned around and said, all right, then. So he withdrew it. So Browning knew, and Browning was not an experienced airborne officer, by the way, but he knew that if he made a fuss about something, they'd replace him, right? And bear in mind, he was the British commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, which was mostly American. Like, it had 2 American divisions, 1 British division, plus the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade. So Browning knew he couldn't make a fuss about anything because they'd sack it. And again, this comes back to Britain's ever weakening position in World War II. In June 1944, Britain and Canada landed slightly more troops than the Americans did. And the vast majority of the naval forces supporting the D-Day landings were Royal Navy, not the USN, which was mostly in the Pacific. As World War II went on, the British and Commonwealth forces became a smaller and smaller proportion of the Allied forces. And this was something we talked about earlier with Montgomery, etc. This is what happens when you get yourself into a war which bankrupts you, which World War II did, as Winston Churchill did. And when the Americans, and of course Winston Churchill's mother was an American, but when the Americans don't turn out to be patriotic Englishmen, much to the surprise of Winston Churchill and almost nobody else. But, there we go. But yeah, I'm sorry. I'm having a bit of a rant there. But anyway, I'm not a Winston Churchill fan at all. Anything else to say, guys?
Nah, not from me.
Mitch, anything else?
I can't think of anything now. I think I said, but I think I said all I know, yeah. So,
anything you 2 guys would like to plug that you're doing in the near future?
Nah, nothing from me.
Mitch?
Yeah, same. Yeah, same.
All right, guys. I'm gonna don't let the bastards grind you down, guys. It's real easy. Don't let them. We'll be back on Saturday with our normal Splendid Isolation stream when we will look at the interesting position of current politics, current events, and all the rest of it. I'm going to try and play us out for tune, which I really hope works, because this one is actually really appropriate. So let's see if it does.
I'm going to pop off now because I'm proper shattered.
Thanks for coming on, Adam, and you're always most welcome, mate.
Yeah, no worries. See you all Saturday evening.
Yeah, go on, mate. See if this works. It may.
Oh, you lads want to join the mob, just come along with me. Here's some chalky biscuits and a lovely cup of tea. Forget the RAF, the Royal Marines or the Navy. We think you're big and tough to be in the Airborne Infantry. Got off the bus in Aldershot in 1964. They marched us on a parade ground where me father stood before. Old Drummy Williams, he drilled the squad, it seemed like half a day. I've never seen such a motley crew, and then I heard him say, Green on, we're airborne, we know we are the best. Oh, when you put that berry on, you know you passed the test. We'll go anywhere, we'll fight anyone, we're always in the mud. They always send the paras in, 'cause we don't give a toss. They handed me a rifle and a crab bat for me head, a uniform that didn't fit and plywood for me bed. They woke us up at the break of dawn and marched us round a square. I wish that I was home in bed or anywhere else but there. I tapped across the Brecons with a burden on me back. They marched us up to Penny Fan and then they marched us back. You should have joined the Remy, that's what old Drummy said. You still got 25 miles to go before you go to bed. Green on, we're airborne, we know we are the best. Oh, when you put that berry on, you know you passed the test. We go anywhere, we fight anyone, we're always in the muck. They always send the paras in, 'cause we don't give a monkeys. It started out in Ringway 60 years ago. All those boys have volunteered for jumping through the hole. Oh, Winnie and Wood Browning, they watched with all their brass, but they were the ones who were jumping out and landing on their arse. Green on, we're airborne, we know we are the best. When you put that berry on, you know you passed the test. We go anywhere, we fight anyone, we're always in the mud. They always send the paras in, 'cause we don't give a toss. They kicked me out for Albert with a parachute on my back. The PTI said, don't worry lad, if it don't, we'll bring it back. I felt the jolt, me nuts went up, the chute went round and round. At least I didn't mess me pants before I hit the ground. I went for pre-selection with a squad of 25. They handed out the weaklings and the ones that couldn't survive. They handed me berry, then took me by the hand. Oh, welcome to the Maroon Machine, be proud of that young man. Green on, we're airborne, we know we are the best. But when you put that berry on, you know you passed the test. We go anywhere, we fight anyone, we're always in the mud. They always send the paras in, 'cause we don't give a monkeys. They sent us into battle, we took it in our stride. A shouting while Muhammad, we all jumped in with pride. The Royal Marines, they stood and watched, they seemed so mystified. Don't worry lads, we'll sort them out, you run away and hide. Green on, we're airborne, we know we are the best. Oh, when you put that berry on, you know you passed the test. We go anywhere, we fight anyone, we're always in the mud. They always send the paras in, 'cause we don't give a monkeys. They always send the paras in, 'cause we don't give a toss. They always send the paras in 'cause we don't give a.
And that was, of course, Green On, which is a para song from the 1970s. And just as a matter of interest, the worst military punch-up I ever saw was between the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Marines. I was not getting involved in that shit, mate, because I was neither of those guys. But it was quite impressive, I can't say. Anyway, thank you very much to my guests, Armin and Mitch. Hopefully you have a better understanding of what happened at Arnhem and Operation Market Garden than you did before. We'll see you on Saturday for our normal Splendid Isolation stream. And in the meantime, never let the bastards grind you down.